I want to tell you about something that often occurs in youth ministry, and that is that you are just involved in strange things. I was involved in youth ministry for 10 years, and you never really knew what was going to happen. And I've learned this even as a father of small children, that usually when my kid turns around and says, "Hey, Dad, this is so cool, watch me do this," what I'm about to see is something that is very objectively not cool or interesting at all, but they think it's cool, right? And so a few years ago, I was invited to a 1A basketball game that one of my kids was playing in, and it was pretty rough. I don't remember what the score was, but it was a lot to the homegrown farm-bred kids from a rural area and a little to the kids that didn't go to the public school but went to the charter school in a bigger town, and it was rough. And so the kid whose team I went to support, I was just glad because he did get playing time. And it became very clear that he would not have gotten playing time if the game was in any way competitive. It was a true disaster. And I learned how bad it was because when I went up to the coach after the game, I was talking to this kid and his parents and the coach, who was almost a volunteer basis. And I just kind of asked him, it was his first season trying to coach this team up, and I asked him how it was going, and he said, "It's been a lot harder than I thought it would be. You have to be clear in giving instructions than I thought I would have to be, and if you've ever tried to lead people, you know that that's true. You have to say the same thing 20 different ways, the same thing over and over and over again." And he told me that on the first day of practice with the middle school girls, who also were nothing great at basketball, that he did a simple drill where they were chest passing one to the other. And the first thing that happened was a girl who got hit in the face, like full on with a basketball. And he said, "What did you do?" She turned to him and said, "You didn't tell me to catch it." And it's just, it's like, how do you miss that? It's so obvious. It occurs to me that we've maybe been in Genesis so long. And some of you have been with me since February, if anyone's counting, that we can miss the forest for the trees. We can miss the obvious because we get down in these little stories that nobody knows very well sometimes. I think many of you would say that we're coming into this part of the Bible that you probably haven't heard a wealth of sermons from over the course of your life. And so you focus on the story, but you can miss the big thing that's going on. So let me try and catch you up. It starts, we started our story with a man named Abraham, and that song we just sang about how Jesus will come to you. God comes to you. You know, we sing about going to God, but actually God usually reveals himself in the Bible as a God that will come to you. And that's what he does to Abraham. He shows up out of nowhere, says, I'm giving you this promise that you're going to have this promised land, that your family is going to become a nation, and that you are going to be tremendously blessed, and you're going to bless the whole world. And Abraham, at the time, is middle-aged and can't have kids, and thousands of miles away from where this promised land is, and none of that seems like it's going to happen. And you see some partial fulfillment because at the end of Abraham's life, he finally owns a tiny piece of property, and he has one legitimate son. And it's like, okay, this isn't looking so good so far, but then God reaffirms the promise with his son Isaac. And at the end of Isaac's life, he winds up having some wealth, but his one legitimate son, which is Jacob, and that's who we're focusing on now, winds up outside of the land, completely broke, and you're just going, where is this going? How is God going to fulfill his promise in this situation? Well, what we see with Jacob, and for those of you that have been here over the last month, we've seen Jacob, in the most unlikely of ways, receive the same promise from God, that he'll have the promised land, all these offspring, and this blessing. And when it looked like none of it would happen, God met him there, told him it was going to happen. And in the most unlikely and crazy of circumstances, Jacob now finds himself with 12 children. So finally, it looks like we're starting to head that way. I don't think I ever mentioned it 2 weeks ago, but by the way, those 12 children have the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. God is in control of what's going on here. And so he has these kids. What we'll see today is Jacob is going to become, again, by God's providence, a very wealthy man. And in the end, over the next few weeks, we see that God will bring him safely home to the promised land. And if it's ever looking like it's going to work out, it looks great until there's a famine, and then we have the whole rest of the book. And so Genesis is this story where it ebbs and flows, kind of based on people's partial obedience to God and partial fulfillments of God's promise. And it's all pointing us towards this one guy that we just sang about called Jesus, who fulfills all of God's promises and is perfectly obedient. But that's where we find ourselves today. Jacob is in the midst of a difficult time still, but God is working things out in his timing and in his way. Picking up at verse 25, it says, as soon as Rachel had borne Joseph, Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my home and country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, that I may go for you know the service that I have given to you. The situation with Jacob and Laban is tense. These guys have never gotten along well. Ultimately, what we see is really both of these guys are just trying to get a leg up on each other. Laban's a guy with a lot of money, and that's his favorite thing in the world, is his money. But Jacob is a guy that's really just trying by hook or by crook to get all that he can and become this wealthy guy and become these things by his own means. He's not really trusting God. He's just trying to become this man of promise that God has already called him and called him to be. And so he approaches Laban, and we can tell right from the beginning, this is not a request, this is a demand. And this isn't a very friendly word that he says in verse 25. He says, send me away. He doesn't say, please, can I go? He doesn't say, hey, everything's good between you and me, I'm going to get out of here. He says, I'm leaving, send me away. And what we see from Laban is that Laban doesn't like that idea. And we'll pick up on that shortly. Jacob's legal situation is tenuous in this circumstance. If you've been with us the last several weeks, you know that Jacob entered into an agreement where he would be a slave of some kind, an indentured servant. And the payment that he was going to get was that he would get to marry one of Laban's daughters. Well, we know that he got fooled, and so now Jacob winds up having to pay 14 years of service for 2 of his daughters. And so let's just skate over the moral difficulties that many of us have with this situation and just say what the Bible is telling us, that God is working things out through this mess. Jacob now has these children. He wants to go home, and ultimately what he wants is to get more of what he needs to be able to leave. And so he approaches Laban and says, here is the service that I've given to you. Let me leave. And what we'll find out he's looking for is he needs some money. And so looking at verse 27. But Laban said to him, if I have found favor in your sight, I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you. Name your wages and I will give it. Jacob said to him, you yourself know how I have served you and how your livestock has fared with me. For you had little before I came, and it has increased abundantly, and the Lord has blessed wherever I turned. But now, when shall I provide for my own household also? Laban has found one thing out about Jacob over the years, and that's that when Jacob's around, things go well. And so Laban, recognizing the blessing of God, it's kind of an interesting thing. Laban is a pagan. He doesn't worship God, but he seems to realize the truth, which is something that happens over and over again with this family of God's promise, that pagan people seem to recognize that God is moving and doing something in their lives. He just sees Jacob and says, I want to keep you here by any means possible. I want to keep the good things coming. God has blessed you, and because you've been working with my flocks have grown. He wants to keep him around. And so what seems like maybe a comfortable conversation, if you really think about it, Laban inviting Jacob to name his wages, what he's trying to do is get Jacob to remain and indenture himself to Laban again. Laban is not going to give him one more penny if he can avoid it. In fact, we know it if you turn over to Genesis 31 and look at the end here. Genesis 31 is a long chapter, but if you look at verse 42 and 43, we learn how Laban thinks about Jacob and how he sees him. If you look at 42, Jacob tells him that the God of my father, the God of Abraham and the fear of Isaac had not been on my side. Surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. You don't care about me. You don't care about your children that I'm married to. You would send me away with nothing if you could. But he says that God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. And then Laban answered and said to Jacob, the daughters are my daughters, the children are my children, the flocks are my flocks, and all that you see is mine. You can't really think of a more tight-fisted approach to really anything than that. Everything that you have, everything that you are, including these are my grandchildren, that's more important than them being your children. These are my daughters, that's more important than them being your wives. I mean, talk about a toxic relationship with the in-laws, right? This is tough. And so this is going on in the background of this conversation. There's going to be no agreement at all. Laban won't give him anything until he indentures himself again. He realizes Jacob needs money. He's going to take advantage of that. In verse 31, he tells him, what shall I give you? And Jacob said, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this for me, I will again pasture your flock and keep it. Let me pass through all your flock today, removing from it every speckled and spotted sheep, every black lamb, and the spotted and speckled among the goats, and they shall be my wages. So my honesty will answer for me later. When you come to look into my wages with you, every one that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and black among the lambs, if found with me, shall be counted stolen. Then Laban said, good, let it be as you have said. But that day Laban removed the male goats that were striped and spotted, and all of the female goats that were speckled and spotted, and every one that had white on it, and every lamb that was black, and put them in the charge of his sons. And he set a distance of 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob. And Jacob pastured the rest of Laban's flocks. If you look at that, one of the questions that you might have, and it's probably a good question, is it seems like Laban offered back in verse 31 to just give him something first. Why didn't Jacob take the gift, right? Verse 31, what shall I give you? And Jacob says, you will not give me anything. Way back earlier in Genesis, Abraham has 2 instances where he could wind up with something for free, but he chooses to pay for it anyway. If you're anything like me, you're like, why, right? I'm kind of tight with money, I guess, I'm told. So, what's he doing? Why is he not taking the gift? Abraham says in those circumstances, the first one, he has literally just defeated 9 kings. This is way back in Genesis chapter 14. Abraham essentially proved himself the strongest fighter, the most impressive person in all of this land of promise, God's man. And he takes over everything to rescue his son, or his nephew Lot. But he refuses to keep any of the plunder. And when they ask him why, he literally starts giving these people their stuff back. He just wants his family to be safe. And they say, why are you doing this? And he said, no one is going to look at my situation and say that you made me rich. They're going to know that God made me rich. And ultimately, that's exactly what happens. Again, at the end of his life, Sarah dies, his wife, and Abraham is looking for a burial plot for her. And they are happy to let him borrow or rent or just freely use a place where he could bury his wife. And again, he refuses to do it. And actually, much like we're going to see with Jacob, he takes a terrible deal. He pays like 4 times what this piece of land is worth. But he refuses to accept it for free because he said, again, it's going to be an indisputable fact that I own this land and that God has provided, and that by God's provision I own this piece of the promised land. And that's how Abraham dies. No one doubts that God has blessed him and that he is a rightful owner of a piece of that land. And so that's kind of what Jacob is playing at. No one is going to say that you made me rich by gifting me everything that I needed. I'm going to earn my keep, and in the end, we're going to see that God is the one providing for me. It's going to be indisputable that all that I have is mine, and all that I have is given to me by God. Now that's not a model for us as far as how we ought to do business, right? But it is a model for us as far as how we should understand the things that we have and the blessings that we have. Jacob refuses to take the gift because he wants it to be clear that it is God who has given every gift that he has. And so all the good things that we see in Jacob's life are clearly the result of God's blessing. And so what's the deal? Because it's a weird deal that he makes. He makes this deal where they're going to take all of the lambs, all of the goats, all of the animals that are typically considered less desirable. If they got marks on them, if they got spots on them. If you remember, this is an ancient pre-Israelite culture, but it's not uncommon that what you see in the Jewish sacrificial system, that it's got to be a spotless white lamb. Like, that's not an uncommon thing. You just go and look at one lamb and look at another and think this lamb's got like bruises all over its body and it's got this weird tuft of black hair coming out. And then this one looks right and you go, that's the one I want. Also, there's a whole lot more white lambs than there are black ones. I don't know if anyone ever, sang you the song Ba Ba Black Sheep, but the black sheep are rare, right? Very rare. A shepherd's normal wages would be about 10 to 20% of what kind of under his care, the animals that were bred. It'd be about 10 to 20% of those animals would be his normal payment. And then also probably a percentage of whatever kind of milk sales or wool sales would happen. So they're usually in it for a much bigger cut because these animals that were spotted and speckled probably would have been, less than 10%. Most goats are dark in color and not white, and most lambs are light in color and not black, and he's asking for the opposite, right? So Laban is like, yes, I will take this deal in a heartbeat. On the face of it, it's a horrible deal. Why would you ever do this? And then what we see at the end, if you're wondering, is Laban goes on and makes it worse. Jacob and Laban actually agree together that what they're going to do is Jacob is going to take the goats out, but Laban goes ahead and takes the goats out quickly himself and separates all of the sheep and the goats that aren't perfect and white and nice looking and sends them 3 days away. And what he's trying to do is he's trying to make sure that no more black or speckled goats are bred into the flock. We're going to make sure that we keep all the white goats together, and then Jacob's going to get pretty much nothing. That's his goal. And so that's the setup. What we really are about to see is this truth right here. God uses difficult situations and difficult people, and he still gets his way. God gets his way regardless of whether the situation's hard, regardless of whether the people's hard. Listen, if you've ever worked a job that's worked and gone well, you know this is true. If you've ever been in ministry at all, you know this is true. There's always difficult situations to be overcome. There's always difficult people to be overcome. But that doesn't get in the way of God and what he does and what he can do. And ultimately, just what God wants to do is what goes. And that's what we're about to see. Verse 37, then Jacob took took fresh sticks of poplar and almond and plane trees and peeled white streaks in them, exposing the white of the sticks. He set the sticks that he had peeled in front of the flocks in the troughs, that is the watering places where the flocks came to drink. And since they bred when they came to drink, the flocks bred in front of the sticks, and so the flocks brought forth striped, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob separated the lambs and set the faces of the flocks toward the striped and all the black toward the flock of Laban. He put his own droves apart and did not put them with Jacob's flock. Whenever the stronger the flock were breeding, Jacob would lay the sticks in the troughs before the eyes of the flock, that they might breed among the sticks. But for the feebler of the flock, he would not lay them there. So the feebler would be Laban's, and the stronger would be Jacob's. Thus the man increased greatly and had large flocks, female servants and male servants, and camels and donkeys. Now, if you're wondering what in the world just happened, you are in the same boat as me about 4 days ago. Because this is the most confusing thing, I think, in the Bible. Or one of them, because it just doesn't make any sense. So let's think through this logically. Did the black and spotted sheep come up because they were looking at sticks with stripes in them? No. Right? That is superstition. And if you remember a couple of weeks ago when Jacob's wife Rachel really wanted to get pregnant, she just had to have these mandrakes, right? She had to have these mandrakes so that she could make some kind of weird mandrake draft, and it was going to make her get pregnant. She was 100% sure of it. And did it work? No. God's will and God's timing worked, even though she was barren, but no, not the mandrakes. That didn't work. This is the same kind of thing that we're seeing. Is this superstition? Is it silly? We look at it and go, yeah, that's completely ridiculous. It doesn't really matter what the goats are looking at or what the sheep are looking at when they're mating. Genetics don't change like that. Genetics just work. So this is ridiculous. Now the other thing that he employs is he makes sure that he's breeding the stronger looking goats with the stronger goats and ignoring the weaker goats. And the result is that they were also spotted and speckled. Now, does that make sense? Actually, yes. If you know anything about breeding, this is a really smart play. Because what he's doing is he is effectively correctly reverse engineering the genetics. Ruthie is a vet tech and can tell you that 10 times out of 10, that Heinz 57 mutt that you find in a dumpster somewhere is probably genetically superior to that purebred dog. It might not be desirable, but pure breeding is pretty much inbreeding, folks. I mean, at some point, what you're going to have is a weaker animal. And if you're willing to breed stronger animals despite whatever kind of recessive genes they might have, like, I don't know, being speckled and spotted, you're going to actually wind up with more speckled and spotted animals. This is just a fact. That's kind of how it works. And if you don't believe me, just look at French bulldogs. I'm sorry if anyone has a French bulldog, but those animals are genetic nightmares. Those animals are born not being able to breathe properly. And that's part of the design. I don't know who made it up, but it was somebody's idea. And you can get your purebred bulldog, but that does not mean it's a healthy animal, right? It doesn't work like that. So yes, he's looking at the white ones, and yes, that does make sense. But ultimately, what we see here is God's provision. If you look at him in chapter 31, starting in verse 10, Jacob recounts what just actually happened here. We don't learn it in this story, but he reflects back on it in my Bible on the same page. And he says, in the breeding season of the flock, I lifted my eyes up and saw in a dream that the goats that mated with the flock were striped, spotted, and mottled. Then the angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob. And I said, here I am. And he said, lift your eyes and see all the goats that mate with the flock are striped, spotted, and mottled. For I have seen all that Laban is doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar and made a vow to me. You see, ultimately, despite what Jacob might have thought had worked superstitiously, despite his actual good shepherding and breeding practices that are going to bring about his desired result, Jacob gives the credit for this plan to God. Despite impossible circumstances, probably less than 10% of the flock, Laban was 100% sure that none of this would work. By God's providence, what winds up happening is Jacob has all the good animals, and Laban has pretty much nothing. And those animals that he does have are the weakest and the sickliest ones, and Jacob's got himself a good, valuable, strong flock. If you're anything like me, you think, well, doesn't that seem just a little bit unfair? Why does Laban wind up with the weak animals? Let me just give you two thoughts here. First is God does what's right. In Job chapter 5:13, it says that God catches the wise in their own craftiness, and the schemes of the wily are brought to a quick end. In Psalm chapter 7, verse 14 and 15, it says, behold, the wicked man conceives evil. He makes a pit, digging it out, and he falls into the hole that he has made. More importantly, God keeps his promises. In Genesis 12, chapter 3, God promises Abraham the same promise that he reaffirms to Isaac, the same promise that he reaffirms to Jacob. And in that instance, he tells him that those who bless you, I will bless, and those who curse you, I will curse. And this strange story, in so many ways, that maybe we go, okay, I understand it a little bit better. I see what's happening. I see that God's in this thing and he's doing this. Well, what just happened? Don't get stuck in the trees. God just fulfilled his promise, and by a miracle, he made Jacob a very wealthy man. Jacob has no ifs, ands, or buts about this. This is what has just happened. God has fulfilled his promise, and God has been faithful. And the good news for you and me today is that God has always been faithful in fulfilling his promises. Actually, what we see in this story, and what we see in many stories in Genesis, is a pattern of God's salvation that has always been that way and is still that way today. We see that God fulfills his promises through suffering to people that believe in his promises. In Genesis 15:6, Abraham, we're told that he believed God. He didn't know all that God was going to do. He didn't have any clue how God was going to do it. He was an old man with no kids. And God promised him that he would make him a man that was wealthy, that had a whole nation descended from him. How is that even possible? Well, it's not possible unless there's a God who can do the impossible, who's going to fulfill his promises. And so Abraham believes God, and that was credited to him as righteousness. His literal salvation, and salvation has always come to those who believe that God is going to fulfill every promise and doing what he said. That was a question that I had for a long time. How were people saved in the Old Testament? They believed in Jesus. They just didn't know what that meant. They just said God's going to do it somehow. They didn't get saved by making a sacrifice. You can go kill a pig or a lamb or whatever you want to. It doesn't fix anything. They believed God. They trusted that somehow he was going to bring about their salvation, and he did. His name is Jesus. We see that out of this suffering, in this impossible situation, Abraham meets Jacob. Or God meets Jacob. Sorry, guys. It's been a long weekend. God meets Abraham when there's no hope and no possible help. And Abraham's salvation ultimately comes about because God is faithful to his promise. God meets Isaac and Jacob here in this hopeless situation. Isaac is still alive, and he's like my grandfather. He's thought he was going to die for the last 20 years, but he's actually still around, and he is faithful to Isaac, who sees no way that he's going to have these descendants. The son of promise, Jacob, is off 1,000 miles away. I haven't talked to him in 20 years, but what he doesn't know is that by a miracle, God has made Jacob a very wealthy man, and he has given him descendants that will become a nation. God is faithful to his promise, and he will do it in the most impossible of circumstances. Fast forward, this family spends 400 years in slavery in Egypt. In the meantime, you know what God's doing? He's fulfilling his promises. Those people in slavery become a massive number of people, numbering over 1 million in that 400 years, despite their circumstances. And when God sees the right time to fulfill his promises, he acts and he rescues this family from slavery. And he brings them to the promised land. That's what the next book in the Bible is about. Do you see where I'm going? All of this points to the greatest need. It's the greatest need that we discussed in our Sunday school class this morning. When Jesus looked at that scribe and he knew all the rules, and Jesus told him, "You are not far from the kingdom of God." He was pointing out that this man had the greatest need. And that was what all of us have, that none of us obey, that none of us are faithful. And God meets us in the greatest need that we could possibly have, the need for him to forgive our sins. And through the most significant act of suffering ever, he sacrifices his son Jesus on the cross for our sake. This is the same God that is faithful to fulfill his promises in every moment, in every season. Our greatest need, and his greatest suffering, not because some guy died on a cross, but because the most valuable person who's worth more than all people ever put together died in our place. The greatest need met through the greatest suffering, because God is faithful to his promises. Let me remind you of this morning. In 2 Corinthians chapter 1, in verse 18, Paul says, "As surely as God is faithful, our word to you has not been yes and no. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who we proclaim to you, Silvanus, Timothy, and I, was not yes and no, but in him it is always yes. For all the promises of God find their yes in him." Jesus is the fulfillment of every promise that God has ever made. I don't know who all of you are or what all of you go through, and I certainly don't know all the details, but I know this, is that your greatest need is not financial, your greatest need is not health, your greatest need is none of those things. Your greatest need is for a relationship with God. Your greatest need is for a God that, like we just sang a while ago, that he will seek you out, and he has done so in Jesus. And so if you've never trusted in Jesus, if you've never trusted in the promises of God, and what a blessed hope we have that we look forward to as Christians, that we're going to live in God's presence forever. If you've never trusted in Jesus, I would love to talk to you about that this morning. Let's pray.